We marched from Kimmage Camp down to the tram line and got in at Harold's Cross on the first tram that came along. And I went upstairs along with the others, and Plunkett then came upstairs and asked how many were there.
And now George Plunkett paid for everybody's fare. And we got out at O'Connell Bridge and we marched down to Liberty Hall.
Liberty Hall was the rallying point from which volunteers and citizen army men, with the youth and women's organisations, the Fina and Cumann, were to spread out to strong points all over the city.
Now, all the officers of the volunteers were there. Pearse, McDonough, McDermott and all these. And outside was all the volunteers that were going to come, and the Fina boys and Cumann. And there was Fina boys there with pikes. Pikes, you know, imagine going into battle with a pike. Well, when Connolly had everything arranged, he told Captain McCormick to pick a section of men, and he picked 28 men and 8 boys, and I was one of the 8 boys. And we marched out, and we were the first to leave Liberty Hall.
My mother was standing at the door of our home, and she was horrified, I can tell you, when she saw me marching down with a gun on my shoulder. Particularly as I was up in the very front on the left-hand side, nearer to where she was standing. So we marched then up to Clarence Street, and then along Clarence Street and into Boland's Mill. But we marched into the bakery, and I can tell you the workers there looked aghast at a lot of armed men marching in, and we told them that the baking would have to stop, so that we were taking over the mills. So some of them asked us what it was all about and all that kind of. They couldn't make head or tail of it any more than some of ourselves couldn't make head or tail of it.
The main body of men, with Connolly, Pearse and Clark, marched to the building in the very centre of Dublin which had been chosen as headquarters for the rising, the General Post Office.
Round about midday, there was a commotion down on the street and the breaking of glass and a lot of, you know, commotion. And everybody wanted to see out through the windows to see what was going on. But shortly after that, the door was banged open, and I was up in the instrument room at where the telegraphs were, and they were a number of men, round about 20, came into the room and dressed in green uniforms with rifles in their hand. They ordered everybody to get out immediately, and I think I was one of the last, really, because I was interested in getting a bicycle that I had down in the basement back so as I could get home. And he very, very politely told me that it would be too dangerous and that he wouldn't advise me to try and get it back.
And a little later, passers-by were bewildered to hear an Irish Republic proclaimed by Patrick Pearse from the front of the building.
In the name of God, ran the proclamation which Pearse read out. In the name of God and of the dead generations from which she receives her old tradition of nationhood, Ireland, through us, summons her children to her flag and strikes for her freedom.
I didn't hear him, but I saw him. There was a fairly big crowd around. As I say, I didn't hear him because I was inside, but I could see them.
While mentioning the support of gallant allies in Europe, the Germans, the proclamation said that Ireland depended first on her own strength and was striking in full confidence of victory. The first victory was over a party of lancers jingling down O'Connell Street, apparently unaware of what was happening. Some volunteers were still on their way to the General Post Office.
I was going up towards the GPO. Firing broke out. This was when the Lancers came down the top of the street, and we took up position in doorways and got ready to defend ourselves. They were just trotting down the street as if they were going towards the barracks or something like that. They weren't actually ready for military action. When the firing had died down, we went on and went into the GPO. Well, there was a scene of great activity there. They were filling up mail bags full of coal. It was the only thing they could get, and the cellars were full of coal in the place. The first thing I knew, I was drafted into the coal detail. And we were nearly smothered. The dust was rising all over the place.
I was immediately put to carrying sacks of nails and sand to barricade the front windows of the post office.
Now, the inside, we barricaded all the windows that we were allotted to. They were barricaded. Barricaded with a lot of stuff that we got from the waxworks further down Henry Street. Remember, there was a waxworks there. Effigies of the King and the Queen and Kitchener and all kinds of, well, they were the, we used them to stick on the windows, the barricade.
And having barricaded themselves in, the rebels in the GPO awaited the reaction of the British. Jacob's biscuit factory, which commanded Portobello Barracks, was also being taken over. But opposition to the rising came from other quarters besides the British Army.
After some odd adventures, I got as far as Jacob's, and by God, there was a hostile crowd there, waving Union Jacks, calling on the lads inside, come out, you lot of effing slackers. If you want to fight, go out and fight in France and all this. They were waving Union Jacks and God knows what.
And as we came out on the street, there was a terrible hullabaloo of women and men. They were like, had sons and people in the British Army. And they called it all the names you could think of, you know. And one man made a grab at a rifle. So the Lieutenant Burden says to him, keep your hands off now, he said, you'll be sorry. So he wouldn't. So Burden shot him.
Another early casualty had been an Irish policeman shot dead at the gate of Dublin Castle, the very centre of British rule in Ireland. But though it was virtually undefended, the rebels didn't press the attack home. The same Monday afternoon, a column of elderly reservists, known from the words Georgius Rex on their belts as the Gorgeous Rex, had been out in the Dublin mountains unaware of events in the city.
We saw the poor members of Gorgeous Rex coming back. They all had rifles, but no ammunition. And the next thing we heard a volley, and the poor unfortunates, one of them I think was shot dead.
4 were killed, in fact, 8 wounded. In the centre of Dublin, the chief event had been not military at all, but civilian, looting.
It was really swarms of people coming from all the side streets and all over the streets, crossing O'Connell Street to get into a shop called Cleary's, because it was the Harrods of Dublin, really.
As we say in Dublin, all the old ones were out and putting sacks across their backs full of all kinds of things. You know.
Women were carrying and wearing fur coats and carrying loads of furs and clothes, and men were bent at double, carrying great bales of material, tweeds and things like that.
I saw one fellow go along with the dress suit on him in the middle of the day. Yeah, and he had a golf club.
And then they used to have a row with each other, because one old lady would take from the other old lady, you know, if she thought there was more in her sack. And there was a lot of punch-ups. I saw one old one catch the other old lady by the hair and pull her across the road, you know. It wasn't nice.
Although it was horrifying to see, it was the poor people of Dublin really had a ball.
There were about 1,000 rebels out altogether by now. There were 2,500 British troops based in Dublin, but of these only some 400 were on permanent alert, spread over different barracks of the city. The rest were away at Fairyhouse races or otherwise enjoying the public holiday. Reinforcements were at once sent for. 1,600 men from the Curragh, artillery from Athlone, and from England 2 infantry brigades, which arrived at Kingstown Harbour on Wednesday morning.
We arrived in Kingston. It was 5 minutes past 5 in the morning by the clock at Kingston Harbour when we got there. And we were put on the on the wharf sort of thing. And the women, they came down there literally in dozens and dozens and dozens, bringing tea, biscuits, cakes.
They were just like one of us. They were pleased as, they seemed as pleased as could be that we had arrived.
The loyal Irish was showering us with bars of chocolate and fruit.
Everywhere we went, we could have had 10 breakfasts a day if we'd have wished. Honestly, the Irish people then, they couldn't have treated us better if it had been their own.
These troop reinforcements from England set off for Dublin in 2 columns. One column met no opposition and, taking another breakfast or 2 on the way, marched round the city to bivouac safely at Kilmainham. Here they joined the cordon of troops, English and Irish, being thrown round the rebels in the centre of the city, and took up positions preparatory to drawing that cordon tighter still. Action in the centre of Dublin was still only sporadic, and meanwhile the other column had run into deep trouble. What happened was that, proceeding unconcernedly down Northumberland Road towards the centre of Dublin, at the junction of Northumberland Road and Haddington Road, by Mount Street Bridge, they ran into small outposts of the rebel strong point at Boland's Mill. In this house, the rebel outpost consisted of 2 men.
Around about 1 o'clock in the day, we heard the noise of marching men and looked out, and here we saw, as we thought, the whole British Army coming in. And they were marching along quite unconcernedly. They hadn't been fired on up till then. And the men in number 25 waited until they got to the junction of Haddington Road and Northumberland Road, and they opened fire on them.
Oh, it was from the other side of the street. They were just firing from the bedroom windows, and we'd no shelter at all, so the casualties were pretty heavy.
Some of them fell dead, others threw themselves on the ground, because they didn't know from where the firing was coming. So then, of course, after that, they didn't march. They actually crept on their tummies along the road.
We had to stop naturally and take what cover we could. I believe it was there where Colonel Fane gave the orders to attack this place. Well, it was futile, you know. They've got to go across an open ground, and well, he hadn't gone many yards before he was face down.
He was wounded, and he came out with, now I don't know whether it was his sword or not, but he came out and tried to rally the soldiers. And so, really, although at the time we wanted every British person to be shot, but you couldn't but admire him when he came right out into the middle of the street again and got them together.
Well, we thought there were probably 200 or 300, but apparently they weren't. But their fire was so good and so accurate that they misled the troops as to the numbers.
It would have been between 6:30 and 7. It was still bright. And when they made an almighty rush.
Under heavy fire, we sent the hand grenade people in, and they were throwing the grenades in and burnt and busted them out.
And they got up the steps and they threw a bomb at the door, and we heard an explosion and we saw a bright light, and we knew it was the end of those 2.
It was a bit rough, as I say. We lost an awful lot of men around about, an awful lot. I was one of the lucky ones.
There'd been only 17 rebels altogether in all these outposts of the Mount Street Bridge area. British casualties were 230 killed and wounded, nearly half those of the entire rising. Meanwhile, in Dublin itself, where the bombardment of British artillery had already started fires, the infantry were, by the next day, Thursday, moving steadily in towards the centre.
When it became daylight the next morning, there was, crowds of furniture of all descriptions had been brought out of these houses and put in the road to make the roads impassable to traffic.